And so I'm going to go ahead and start webinar, and that will just allow everyone to enter. So we'll allow people to get in and get comfortable. Hi, everybody. We're so excited to have you here. And while you're all getting settled, so Rose with us this afternoon. I'm assuming you already know that because you signed up for this. But what you might not know is that Dr. Rose has been a very big supporter of our program, and she's been part of the National Biodiversity Teach-In from the beginning. And one of the things that I appreciate most about Dr. Rose and her participating with us is the way she works with our students. So this is a student-run project, and so there are typos and there are all kinds of, things that happen, and I'm always appreciative of how her expectation of what the students do and making sure they know what they're doing and do it right, that attention to detail. I appreciate that she partners with us in that, because this is a learning experience for our students. That's just something I've always appreciated about you, and I wanted to make that true. So also, we intentionally invited Dr. Rose to today because today is a very special day. International Day of Women and Girls in Science. And the purpose of the day is to achieve full and equal access to and participation in science for women and girls across the world. And I guess we should also include everyone who identifies, right, as well. So with that, I'm going to turn off my camera. I'm going to turn this over to you. There is a Q&A feature. So please put your questions in the Q&A. And then if you're on YouTube, we'll send your questions in. So Dr. Rose.
Welcome, everybody. As you can see from the first slide, my talk is going to be about the impact of captivity on the welfare of orcas and belugas. Both of these species of whale are held in fairly large numbers, particularly belugas, around the world. And I work for the Animal Welfare Institute, and I have since 2013, and that's the logo in the background of my video screen there. 59 orcas are confirmed to be held in 8 countries. We've got orca exhibits. We're talking about the killer whale or Sinus orca in the US, Argentina, Canada, China, France, Japan, Russia, and Spain. And you can see the numbers there at the bottom. A lot of these orcas have only come into captivity in recent years because they were captured from the wild in Russia. And so even though Russia only has 3 of these animals, China has 15, and all of them came from Russian waters. But there's hundreds of belugas that are displayed in at least as many countries. The United States has about 30, and China has well over 100, and Russia has dozens as well. So Europe, some other facilities have belugas. The next most frequently held animal is the bottlenose dolphin, which I won't be discussing in this talk. So what I want to cover is the welfare of these animals once they come into captivity. The fact is that these are wide-ranging, large oceanic predators. And whenever you hold a wide-ranging mammal, or for that matter, a bird, in confinement, you're affecting their welfare. Whether it's positive or negative, you are affecting their welfare. And so what I'm going to argue in my presentation is that you are affecting their welfare negatively. Now, somebody else might argue to you that it's neutral, that there's no real effect on their welfare when they're put into captivity. But I don't hold that position, and I feel that the data are overwhelmingly in support of my position these days. The more science we collect on this issue, the stronger the argument becomes that these large, wide-ranging oceanic predators do not belong in captivity because they cannot thrive there. So the first thing that's very different for these animals when they're free-ranging versus when they're in captivity is the amount of space they're given. That should be kind of intuitive. Anybody who's ever seen a picture, let alone the actual live animal out in the wild, can see that they have quite a bit of space, even if they're not wide-ranging oceanic predators like orcas are. They might be coastal, or they might sometimes spend time on land if they're seals or sea lions. Nevertheless, if they're an oceanic mammal, they have the ocean. And so when they're put into a tank or a sea pen, it's quite small for them, just from their own perspective. And you really need to see this from the animal's point of view as much as you can. So here's some data for you. The small print, don't pay any attention to it. It's just the reference for what I'm telling you. And I want you to understand that all of this comes from the peer-reviewed literature. Orcas routinely swim several miles a day. They can travel as many as 225 kilometers, which is about 140 miles. 140 miles a day for up to 30 to 40 days without rest. These are powerful animals. These are wide-ranging animals. These are dynamic animals. They're always moving, even when they sleep. They are moving because they are mammals. They have to breathe. They're in water. All of those things combined mean if you become truly unconscious when you sleep, you're going to drown. And so they're always moving, even if it's very, very slowly and very, very carefully when they're doing what we call resting. They nevertheless are moving forward. They routinely dive to depths in excess of 500 meters, which is about, think about it, do the math, that's 1,500 feet or so. And a shallow dive is in excess of 7 meters or 20 feet. In some populations, individuals can dive in excess of 200 meters up to a dozen times a day. So they're constantly going quite deep in the ocean. They're literally adapted. They have evolved to spend time at depth, right? They have very fascinating, all the whales and dolphins have unique adaptations to spending time at depth as mammals. They have to breathe. I just said that, right? They have to breathe. So how is it that they can hold their breath for up to 15 minutes at a time? There are ways, we're not very good at it, but these aquatic mammals are. And as you can see, as the last point here, orcas often dive deeper than 150 meters, which again is about 450 feet, at least once every 5 hours. This graphic is one of my favorites. It was done by an activist based on data from the Cascadia Research Collective, who had tagged a male killer whale in the Pacific Northwest. Orcas are also known as killer whales. The reason I love this graphic is it tells a story. Pictures are worth 1,000 words, all right? So from when you're looking at the graph, from left to right is a yellow line that represents the actual track of the dive of this tagged animal. So he is a big male. He's at sea level on the left. He goes down meandering. He gets down to 600 feet, almost 525 feet, 160 meters, and he does something down there. He's actually down there doing something, moving around. He's not just going down there and sitting on the bottom. He's actually, we believe, chasing fish. Then he meanders back up to the surface so that when you're on the right, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but when you're on the right, there he is near the surface. That whole dive from left to right takes about 5 minutes. So he's holding his breath for 5 minutes, and he's not just doing what we would do. For example, a long breath holding dive that a champion swimmer might do, going down and coming up. He's going down and he's doing something. That little blue box in the middle of the graph at the top, the lighter blue with the circle around it. Again, I hope you can see my cursor. That's SeaWorld. That's the tank that is provided to the up to 10 orcas who live at the complex at SeaWorld. That's what they have 24/7, 365. Whereas this one 5-minute dive is just one 5-minute dive that this big male orca did on one day in his life. Obviously, their home range is much, much bigger than this. And in fact, typical tanks here at the bottom of the slide are 1/10,000%, which is 1/1,000,000th the size of their natural home range, both in horizontal and vertical distance. This is often used to be what they were given. This is a now very outdated tank. The whale you see there, Lolita, is a female orca from the Pacific Northwest, and she's still alive. And she's been living in this tank for about 50 years. But they increased the size of most orca tanks around the world so that they're not quite this ridiculously small, but it's still 1/10,000% the size of their natural home range. And of course, Lolita's is even smaller than that. She has no other orcas with her. She does have some Pacific white-sided dolphins who keep her company, but she's been alone in this tank since 1980 when her male companion Hugo died. And so, it's not the tank that just because she's been living in it for 50 years doesn't mean there's nothing wrong with the tank. Hugo died in 1980 after 10 years in this tank. there's something right about Lolita that she is still alive, basically. So they're just lucky that they had Lolita. She could have gone the way of Hugo. And in fact, a lot of whales in much bigger tanks than this don't live very long. Belugas, same problem. They can travel up to 10 to 20 kilometers a day. They can cover 60 to 70 kilometers, and that's about, well, I can't really do the math as easily. It's 1.6, multiply that by 1.6, and divide it by 1.6 in terms of miles. In 24 hours, a recent study tracked belugas diving to 900 meters. When they dove in excess of 600 meters at least once daily. Sorry, that's my phone ringing in the background. They commonly dive between 10 and 50 meters. Okay, so this is a normal, everyday kind of thing that they can do. This is what they're given in captivity. And I didn't say this earlier, but the depth of Lolita's tank is only 20 feet, right? 7 meters. And remember that orcas can dive up to 450 feet routinely. And the maximum depth they've ever been found at is 900 meters. So this is, to have only 7 meters to live in is clearly not enough depth. Well, it's the same thing with belugas. They can dive just about as deep as orcas can, and they're routinely given very, very small tanks. You can see there's up to 7 animals in the shot, and that's their holding tank. All right, that's not their performance tank. The performance tank is larger, but that's their holding tank where they spend most of their time. Most people who go to these facilities don't realize that these animals spend more of their time in the holding tanks than they do in the performance tanks. So even if the performance tank looks big to you, they don't actually spend that much time in it. So what's the second thing that's really different for these animals when they're out in the wild versus when they're in captivity? Their social groupings. These are highly social animals. They're very intelligent. They're very social. They're probably more social than we are, and we're very social. Just think about the pandemic and the lockdown that you've all been experiencing. It's been hard not to see your friends. It's been hard to be separated from them. Well, the minute we put these animals into captivity, they're separated, not just from their friends, but from their family. And for some of them, that is really unnatural. That is not a normal way for them to live. Belugas are up in the left-hand corner. The orcas, which is a family, that is a family group of orcas in the lower right. The many belugas in the upper left, some of them are relatives, some of them are not. They're just very social. They live in large, large groups, often congregate in 1,000 animals, groups of 1,000 animals or more. Orcas are more family-oriented. A super pod of orcas might be 100 individuals. They're top predators, so they're not that numerous naturally, but that tight formation of swimming like that in a line, that's very common to see in the wild. But once you put them into captivity, they have a very limited social environment. This is Kiska. She lives in Canada. She's all alone. The photo you saw of Lolita at least had some Pacific white-sided dolphins with her. She had some companions who were close to her in terms of being close to the same species, although they weren't. She doesn't have anybody. And the reason was when they did try to put another species in there with her, another species of whale or dolphin, she attacked them. And she did have other orcas to live with for quite some time, but they all died one after the other until she was left alone. And she's still alive as well. She's in her 40s now. So again, you could argue, oh, well, she's still alive, and she's all alone, and she has been for the last 10 years or so, and that can't be that bad. Well, we're worried about her mental health. I mean, she does this a lot. What she's doing there is called logging. It means acting like a log. She's just floating at the surface. She's not swimming. She's not doing anything in particular. And I don't think that's healthy for an intelligent social mammal. So no, she hasn't died yet, but I'm not sure she's really living. And then this is belugas. There's 2 of them in this tank. You saw the tank earlier had 7 or 8. Well, you saw the picture of them in the wild when they were in a group of perhaps a few hundred animals. So it's not that you can't keep them in groups that are at least, 5, 6, 7 animals, but they're the same 5, 6, 7 animals over and over and over again every day of your life. And what if you don't like one of those animals? What if you don't like beluga A? What if beluga C doesn't like beluga A? Well, too bad. They have to live together and they have to cope. And I think that's actually probably a source of social stress for them when they have to live with an animal that in the wild they would either never associate with or at least would avoid for most of the time. Not talking necessarily about dominance, a dominant individual and a subordinate individual. I'm just literally talking about, what if you don't like each other? These are social animals with friends and family. If you don't like somebody, you don't spend any time with them, but not if you're in captivity where you can't go anywhere. What's a third quality of life that differs between free-ranging and captive animals? The environmental quality and complexity, not just the size of it, but what it's like. So orcas have a lack of enrichment in their enclosures. They live in the ocean normally. Well, all they get is a swimming pool. This literally both looks and acts like a swimming pool that you might have at a hotel or something like that. They paint the walls blue so it looks nice and oceanic to you, but it's literally just the color of the walls. It's not the color of the water. And in fact, the lighter the color of the tank, the more reflective it is of light. And if it's a bright sunny day and it's shining into the water like that, that can become a problem. The water is shallow, the walls are reflective of light. These animals are being exposed to higher levels of UV light than would be natural for them. Not just because they're spending too much time at the surface, which isn't normal either, but because when they dive down, which filters out UV light very quickly, they can't dive very deeply. They can only go down to, say, 20 or 30 feet. The maximum depth in a tank that I'm aware of is about 35 feet. In the wild, 30, 35 feet is about where light really starts to filter out in the ocean. And so to escape that kind of UV radiation, a whale might dive to 50 feet or 60 feet, which is perfectly normal for them. It doesn't even stress them out in the least, let alone 100 feet or 200 feet or 300 feet, or that the graph I showed you of that male who went down to 565 feet, where it's dark. And they use echolocation to get around. They don't see down there. They see when they're at the surface and near the surface, and their eyesight is perfectly good. But when they go down into the dark, they need some other sense, and that's echolocation, where they send out clicks, and those clicks bounce off what's around them, and they know where each other is, they know where the fish are, they know where they are. And so they don't need light. And so this overexposure to UV radiation is actually kind of hard on them. It's actually hard on their eyes. Again, plexiglass, concrete walls. This whale is logging again, acting like a log. This is not normal. This is not natural, and we can't provide it for them. And finally, the fourth characteristic that I consider to be very, very different in captivity versus out in the wild is these behavioral restrictions that these animals are subjected to. These are predators, and they hunt prey, and none of that is allowed when they're in captivity. Basically, their job, and you can look at it as a job, as something they have to do every day to survive. You can see that as a hardship, or you can see that as a challenge. I love my job. I hope you all are able to have a job you love someday too. And that is what makes me feel alive. It's what makes me feel important. It's what makes me feel worthwhile. And it's the same for them. You take that away from them, you've taken a lot. So again, orcas, top marine predator. They hunt other marine mammals in some locations. These guys have what we call culture. They learn what is food. They don't instinctively think this is food or that is food. They are taught this is food or that is food. Some orcas are taught that other marine mammals are food, and they learn how to hunt them. That's a sea lion in the upper left, and that's a Dall's porpoise in the lower right. Different hunting techniques. They're taught that hunting technique by their mothers and by their pods as they grow. In captivity, they all eat fish. It's not like they're going to go out and kill a seal and feed that to a seal-eating orca once it's in captivity. You would all be appalled at that. Most little kids would be appalled at that. When you see it out in the wild, it's one thing, but if you saw it in captivity, you wouldn't like it. And so they all feed them fish. Notice the way that whale is sort of floating in the water with his head up and his mouth open. That's also an extremely unnatural posture. Spy hopping is perfectly normal. Looking up and out at the world, sticking their head up above the surface is completely normal. You'll see that all the time. One of my very best photos of whales is of them spy hopping, but their mouth is closed because why should their mouth be open? Food does not fall from the sky in the wild. What's up there in the sky is not important to them. It's what's at the surface and what's below the surface. And of course, all the food is below the surface. In captivity, food falls from the sky. Dead fish falls from the hands of their trainers. And so that open mouth, head up posture is completely an artifact of captivity. Some of them don't eat marine mammals. They eat fish. They're basically the orca, vegetarians, if you will. And so they still have to hunt those fish, and they often do it cooperatively, as the mammal-eating orcas also often hunt cooperatively. So this orca here is herding herring into what's called a herring bowl. And then there's another orca off in the distance. You can barely see it. There's another eye patch right here, if you can see my cursor. And so they're going to take turns going through this herring bowl and eating the herring. So they're cooperating together. Very complex behavior, very social behavior. And then in captivity, you have this. This is an orca performing with cartoon characters. I have to admit, this photo is a little old. They don't really do this anymore at the Miami Aquarium. This is Lolita again, the whale who lives all alone, except for some Pacific white-sided dolphins. But they used to. And the only reason they changed their show format, if you will, and now is more educational, is because of public pressure. So what are the impacts of captivity on orcas and belugas other than that come about because of those differences I just described to you? I'm just giving you examples. There's a lot more that I could talk about in this hour, but it would take more than an hour. So I'm just giving you some examples. This is not all there is, all right? Belugas don't breed very well in captivity. They do, they breed, but not very well. Even when they finally conceive and give birth to a calf, as they're called, the young are called calves, the calves don't have really great survival. So even if a female gets pregnant, which is not that common for belugas, and she carries it to term, which is not that common for belugas, and has a live birth, which is not that common for belugas, the calf may not survive for very long. So the whole thing is just kind of sad. Every once in a while, yes, a calf might be born alive and survive and grow to adulthood and in fact have a calf, his or herself, but that's actually very rare for belugas. So basically, it's pretty well understood that when there's a poor breeding record in captivity for any wildlife species, that suggests welfare is compromised. It's considered a metric of compromised welfare when breeding is poor. However, the opposite is not true. Just because breeding is good does not mean that welfare is good. Some animals like puppies, dogs and puppy mills will breed under the most horrific circumstances. So it's not a given that breeding well means your welfare is good. It just means you have a very strong reproductive drive. Whereas if you don't breed well in captivity, then that means your welfare is severely compromised because even your strong drive to reproduce is compromised. For orcas, there's other very, very obvious, I'm going to give you two very obvious impacts from captivity. One is on their teeth. This is true for all whales and dolphins. Their teeth are often compromised. They're often damaged. They're often injured when they're in captivity. But for orcas, it's really, really obvious because they have these really, really big teeth. Whether they eat fish or whether they eat other marine mammals, they have really, really good hunting apparatus, which is these teeth. This is a wild whale that has died. That's why it looks like this. And that's a set of beautiful teeth that are in very good condition. They're tall, they're conical. You can see a little bit of flattening, or it looks like they've sort of been shaped a little bit, and that's not true. It's not like they're doing that. It's the water that basically passes their teeth when they eat. It slowly wears away at their teeth. It's called lateral abrasion, and basically they're not quite as round as they would normally be when they're born, but they're still not worn flat. This is what happens in captivity. Very common in captivity. This is extremely, extremely rare in the wild. There are some populations with worn teeth like this, but it's because of the way they eat. They actually do things that cause their teeth to wear, and it's a population-wide phenomenon because of what they're eating. In captivity, it's so bad that it actually affects their health because you can see there's holes. They're wearing their teeth down to the gum line until their cavities are exposed. And unlike us, which get our cavities filled if we eat too much sugar or whatever, they can't get their cavities filled because they live in water. You put amalgam into that hole and it's just going to wash out before it sets. So they actually have to leave, the people who take care of these animals in captivity have to leave the hole open, the cavity open, and that's going to be painful. If anybody, has ever had an open cavity, they know what I'm talking about. It's sort of a perpetual toothache. Down in the lower right, you actually see broken teeth. And this is because they don't, I'm sorry, I think I forgot to tell you how this happens. They're actually grinding their teeth on the concrete walls. It's not because of how they eat, because of course fish just fall from the sky right down into their gullets. This is because of a neurotic behavior of grinding their teeth on the walls. The whale down in the lower right, however, has broken teeth, and this is because they're actually snapping at the metal bars of their gates between their tanks. And so they're actually breaking their teeth, which again, for me, that just makes my teeth hurt to think of breaking a tooth on a metal bar. And I think that's exactly how it feels to the whale too. They can't scream in a way that we hear, but they probably scream when they first break their tooth. And again, the tooth has to stay open. It can't be filled with amalgam. And so they just have to try to keep the tooth very, very clean. They have to wash it out multiple times a day to make sure it doesn't start to rot. And this is a paper that was published on tooth wear and damage in captive killer whales. This was done by folks who are very concerned about orca welfare. It was not done by the folks who take care of these whales. You would have thought that they would have published a paper or two on this phenomenon because it's very marked in captive orcas, but they haven't. It was up to folks who didn't have access to the animals' medical records because they don't work at these facilities and the facilities didn't cooperate with them, who had to just monitor and catalog the damage. What we would really like to know is, does that in fact cause health problems for these animals? Bad teeth cause bad health. This is true for anybody, your cat, bad teeth. Your veterinarian will tell you it'll shorten your cat's life if they don't get their teeth cleaning or bad teeth removed. Same thing for us. If we have gingivitis or periodontitis, we can have our lives shortened. It can actually affect our overall body health. It's true for these animals as well. Dorsal fin collapse is the most obvious impact of captivity on orcas. It's also true for bottlenose dolphins to a lesser degree because their dorsal fins are lower, they're not as tall. But what you'll see in captivity is this. This is actually Tilikum, the whale who killed his trainer, Don Brancho. I'll talk about that in a minute. His dorsal fin had completely collapsed over the left of his back. So it didn't fall over, it grew this way. So he started out normal, and as he grew, gravity just started acting on this tall appendage that sticks straight up into the sky and pulled it over. If you went up to it, it's not floppy. You can see it's not actually touching his back. It's just wrapped over his back and isn't touching it. If you went up to it and tried to move it, it'd be a solid slab of very, very thick and solid taffy. But it grew that way. It literally had gravity slowly pulling on it, just like a tree that grows in an extremely windy cliff looks like it's bent down to the ground. It grew that way. It didn't suddenly collapse. It's perfectly alive and it's got roots. It just grew that way because the wind is always blowing on that cliff. This is a collapsed dorsal fin on a wild orca. So it's not that it never happens in the wild. It's the frequency with which it happens that differs markedly in one environment to the other. In captivity, 100% of adult male killer whales have their dorsal fins collapse. Only 1 to 5% have what happens on the right. And that's usually because of an injury or an illness. They have a tall dorsal fin sticking straight up and something happens to them, an injury to the fin, a gunshot, an arrow, who knows, or an illness that might actually be natural. And it weakens the connective tissue inside that dorsal fin. There's no bone, there's no cartilage, and it just slowly collapses once the animal's alive, an adult and is still living and had a tall dorsal fin. It collapses over time, say a year or so. Whereas on the left, it grows that way. Well, this is what it's supposed to look like. All right, this is an adult male killer whale with a perfectly normal, healthy dorsal fin. No injuries, no illness. That's how it looks. There's not a single male killer whale in captivity that has a dorsal fin like this. Not one. And yet 99 to 95% of all male killer whales who are adults in the wild look like the guy on the bottom there. Recent data on survivorship for orcas. You can see that in the wild, 81% get to be sexually mature, but in captivity, only 46% do. Menopause, which orcas experience, it's actually a very rare phenomenon in the animal kingdom for a female to stop being reproductive and still survive beyond that. Basically, both males and females only have evolutionary value if they can reproduce. And so females, even elephants, will reproduce right up until they die, and they can live to be 60 years old. But for orcas who can live to be much older than that, great deal of those years, say up to 45 to 50 of those years, might be post-reproductive. They are grandmas, and they have the value to a society that grandmas have, knowledge, wisdom, and so on. And so they survive past their ability to reproduce. But in captivity, we have only 7% of the females who've actually become post-reproductive. Most die long before they reach menopause in captivity. And then another paper, which was actually done by folks who work for the public display world, survivorship rates in captivity are comparable to populations of threatened and endangered orcas. And the way I put that for most folks is whatever's going on in captivity, and we really don't know all the mechanisms involved here because it's hard to do the research when the facilities won't cooperate with you. But whatever is going on that affects the lifespan, the longevity, whatever you want to call it, the survival rate of captive orcas versus wild ones is very similar to whatever the threats are that cause endangerment and threatened status out there in the wild. They're certainly not the same mechanisms. It's not pollution, it's not food shortages, it's not human impacts on their habitat, which is what's going on in the wild. It's something else about captivity. I think it's something inherent to captivity, and we believe it's stress, which I'll talk about in a second, that shortens their lives. For belugas, we have fewer data from the wild. We don't have very good data from the wild at all, whereas we have very good data from some populations in the wild for orcas. But based on what we do have, it looks like their lifespans are as much as halved, right? And some of this work is very new. You can see the paper at the very bottom is from 2020, and it verifies some of the data that comes from other methods that show that belugas can live to be about 60 to 70 years old. Doesn't mean they all live that long, all right? In fact, if your maximum age is 60 to 70, then a lot of you are only living to be 35 or 40. Sort of the same way we could live to be 120, but very few of us get there. Most of us die in our 70s, 80s, and 90s. So basically 35 to 40 is 80 to 90 for a beluga whale, 60 to 70 is 120. However, when you have that, 120 is 60 years. 60 years isn't very good for a human being. That's very young to die. I'm 58. I certainly hope I live well past 60. So for most belugas not living beyond 35, which is half their maximum possibility, it's not good. This is what it's like in captivity for them. Research, conservation, education. I'm sure all of you have heard those as justifications for keeping these animals in captivity. Actually, very few papers based on research from captive animals is published in the literature. Even bottlenose dolphin, who are the most numerous species held in captivity, and research is done on them, only have about a third of the papers that are published come from captive animals. 2/3 of the papers published on bottlenose dolphins are coming from wild studies these days. So that's very interesting. And then very few of the research papers that are using captive animals address conservation topics, which is what they claim they're doing. They claim it's important to do research on captive animals to help animals in the wild. That's conservation. But in fact, very little of the research that's being done on these captive animals addresses conservation questions. So what the industry claims, which is what's at the bottom there, isn't what it actually does. Captures are still occurring, and that's the final point I want to make, that this is still a problem for these animals. When you think about zebras or giraffes or even, rhinos or anything like that, they're charismatic megafauna held in zoos, but they don't come from the wild very often anymore, of course. In fact, in some places, they don't come from the wild at all. They're entirely maintained at the population they are in captivity by captive breeding. And that's actually a goal for most zoos and aquariums. They want most of their animals to come from captive breeding because they don't want to have to capture animals from the wild. Even if they're healthy populations out there, they don't want to do it because they know it's a stressful process. Well, these animals, as I just told you, don't breed all that well in captivity. Even bottlenose dolphins, which are the best breeders amongst the species of cetacean, whale, and dolphin that are held in captivity, don't breed that well in captivity, and so they're still caught from the wild. Orcas are still being caught in Russia, as I mentioned earlier. They're going to China for the most part, as I mentioned from one of the earlier slides. And as you can just see the history here, the successful captures only started in 2012. There was a very long period when nobody was capturing orcas anywhere. It had become so controversial. Again, public pressure is everything in this business. It becomes so controversial to take orcas from the wild that nobody was allowing it anymore. Iceland, the United States, nobody was allowing it anymore. And then in 2012, after decades of nobody taking any wild orca, they started up again in Russia. And now they've taken as many as 20 or so. We don't even know how many orcas are in this area where they're taking them. It's probably not more than 250. So they pretty much removed 10% of the population in only 8.5 years. That's terrifying to think of what impact they've had on that population in Russia. This is how they do it. This is a Russian capture boat. That blue tarp that's hanging, and again, I hope you can see my cursor right there on this box-like thing. Well, there's an animal inside that box. It's a beluga, not an orca. But they use the same method to capture, young orcas. They're always capturing young animals because they basically cope better with the transition from the wild to captivity. And older animals, adult animals, don't make that transition very well. They learn that very early on, back in the old days when they tried to capture some adults, and they basically didn't make the transition at all and died very quickly. So now they started up again after a brief hiatus. They did experience some public pushback. And so after about 2 years of not taking any animals between 2016 and 2018, they started up again in 2018. So here they are in what was called the whale jail. I don't know if any of you heard about it, but some of you might have heard about it because it was quite well publicized. This is Russia. This is near Vladivostok. These are pens, and you can see the little white bodies in this aerial photograph, and those are belugas. Underneath this covered area are the orcas. There were up to, at one point, 11 of them. Well, one died over the winter, one orca died over the winter, 3 belugas died over the winter. Now, the Russians claim that they escaped, but as you can see from these pens, it doesn't look like anybody can escape, and certainly it makes no sense that 3 animals would have escaped and 87 belugas wouldn't have when 3 did, and 10 orcas wouldn't have when 1 did. It's much more likely that those 4 animals died. But the good news is all of the other animals, all 97 of them, after a year or so in captivity, were released. None of them entered trade. They were all destined for either facilities in Russia or China, but public pressure was so intense over the months that these animals were held at this whale jail. And this is Russia we're talking about. We're talking about global, international pressure, social media, Twitter, Facebook. It was so intense that the government decided it was too much of a hassle. These animals, and even China didn't want them anymore because they realized they would just cause bad publicity. And so they basically let them all go. Now, did they all survive? We don't know, but we are aware of some that have survived. They were either identified by their natural markings, or a couple of them were tagged. And we do know that they survived at least for several weeks, and a few even for several months. So we have high hopes that some of these 97 animals made the transition back into the wild after a year of having been kidnapped and held in this really dismal place. Some of them clearly didn't, though. We assume they died. This has become quite controversial. Blackfish was released in 2013. A lot of you probably have seen it. If you haven't, I recommend it. Death at SeaWorld was a book, a non-fiction book that was published in 2012. This is all about Tilikum, the male who I showed you, his collapsed dorsal fin, killing his trainer, Don Brancho, in February of 2010. So in fact, we're coming up on her anniversary, the anniversary of her death. February 24th, 2010, it was 11 years ago. Beneath the Surface came out after Blackfish. That was written by one of the trainers who was featured in the documentary. Born to Be Free was a Russian documentary put together by women who were very concerned about the belugas that are going into the wildlife trade. And so this is about that whole capture operation I just showed you some photographs of. Born to be Free. You can find that online, and all of these items are available, on Amazon or Netflix or other Vimeo, other platforms that you can find online. And now the new thing that's happening is a British production company, the Apartment and Castlefield production companies, are producing a 10-episode TV series that is based on the book Death at SeaWorld by David Kirby. And this will be a 10-episode fictionalized drama of the story that's told in Death at SeaWorld about Don Brancho's death and Tillicum's life in captivity, which was quite dismal. He died in 2017, 7 years after he killed his trainer, and never saw freedom, in all of those years when, it was so clear he was not adjusting whatsoever to captivity. They still insisted on keeping him, and that is where he died at the age of 34 or so. So Death at SeaWorld is going to cover the years addressed in the book, which is only through 2011. So it won't go all the way up to the brave new world we live in today, but it will, I think, tell you the story of how this works, and I hope reach a lot of eyes and a lot of hearts. Hopefully it will be released in 2022, although there's still a possibility it may not be made at all because Hollywood is Hollywood, and you never know whether a book to TV show adaptation will actually make it to the finish line. I have done a TED Talk, which I certainly encourage you all to listen to. It's about orcas. It's about what I've just told you, but it focuses entirely on orcas. It's about 18 minutes long, and that's the URL if any of you want it. I can provide it for you by email, perhaps. And I do give my email at the end of the talk. So if you do want to watch this, let me know, and I'll give you the link. We have a campaign going on in China. This is, as you can tell from what I've told you, the growing market for these animals taken from the wild is in China. The expansion of facilities in China is very, very disturbing. On the left, you have a report we wrote in 2015. There were 39 operational parks with belugas, bottlenose dolphins, rissless dolphins, false killer whales, various species of whales and dolphins held in captivity. That was in 2015, 39 operational parks. The report on the right is an update to that from 2020. I think I'm trying to remember whether it was 2019 or I think it was 2019, sorry. We'll do another update in a couple more years. But in 2019, only 4 years later, the number of facilities in China had more than doubled, from 39 to 82. Terrifying. All of them being stocked with wild caught whales and dolphins because they don't know what they're doing and they are not successfully breeding these animals. And they're also building them so fast, going from 39 to 82, where else are they going to get those animals? They're not going to get them from whale and dolphin puppy mills. They're going to get them from the wild. And so most of the animals that are held in these Chinese facilities were wild caught in Japan, where there's a thriving dolphin capture operation, or Russia, which is where all of belugas and the 15 orcas I mentioned earlier that are in China came from. Those 15 orcas, we know very little about them, China being China. I have been to China 3 times now to try to get a glimpse of these animals. I have seen, several of the facilities with whales and dolphins, but not the orca facilities. There's only 3 of them, and I haven't been able to get eyes on the orcas until my latest visit, which was in 2019, when I did see 4 orcas at one park in Shanghai. They looked very, very troubled to me. They weren't healthy. One female was actually regurgitating her food repeatedly. It's literally bulimia, if you know that, food disorder. And it was very disturbing to watch her do it. It was a neurosis. She just kept throwing up her food. She just kept ejecting the food from her gullet out into the water. It wasn't because I think she was sick. I literally think it was bulimia. She was just mentally unhappy. And so there is something going on in these facilities that I think it's just incompetence, and the tanks aren't designed well. So these animals are not just not thriving, they're not coping. And it's hard to believe that they're all still alive. And quite frankly, I'm not sure they are. Again, it's China. It's hard to get information, and maybe they're not. Maybe some of them have died. We just don't know. This is a paper that I co-authored with 5 other co-authors who we worked together to sort of synthesize all the data that I just presented to you. So we put it all together in a paper called The Harmful Effects of Captivity and Chronic Stress on the Well-Being of Orcas. Again, I can provide that paper for anybody who wants to see it. It was published in the Journal of Veterinary Behavior. One of these co-authors is a medical doctor, one is a veterinarian, and two of them are veterinarians, sorry, and the rest of us are cetacean biologists. I'm an orca biologist, Ingrid Visser is an orca biologist, and basically we discussed our concerns and all of the scientific literature that is available to show that there are these impacts that I just described to you on these whales when they're in captivity. So that's the end of my talk. I actually managed to cover it faster than I thought I would. So I've got 15 minutes for questions. That's my email address at the very top. That's my Facebook page, From the Dolphin's Point of View. You may have heard me use that phrase earlier in the talk. I really do urge everybody to try to see life in a concrete tank from the animal's point of view, because these are actually very intelligent social animals that are similar to us in many ways in terms of intelligence and sociality. So if you think it would be miserable to live in one room, no matter how nice the room was, and never go out, and again, I urge you to empathize with your experience during the lockdown of this pandemic, not being able to go to school, not being able to go readily to the restaurants, the theater, wherever it is you go and live your life. This is how life is 24/7, 365 for all of these whales and dolphins that are in captivity. They don't get any choices. They don't get any options. They don't get to pick and choose their friends. They are separated from their families, and their lives are really pretty boring. And again, boring might sound like not such a horrible thing from a welfare perspective, but when it's your life 24/7, 365, it can lead to depression, literally depression, and depression can kill you. So it's not a small thing to be bored, not when you're always bored. And then my final link there is to my social media account, my Twitter feed. And if I'm not terribly active on Twitter, but I do occasionally post there. It's certainly a good way to ask me a question if you have one, although I answer my emails as well. So that's the end of my talk. I'm happy to take any questions. I've got a couple on the Q&A, which I'll answer right away. It says, is the dorsal fin collapse due to them spending so much time at the surface of the water? That is what we believe. And as I mentioned earlier, there's not a lot of research on this. There should be. It would be easy to do, quite frankly. But the facilities that control access to the animals have never done the research and won't allow anybody else to. I think it's a very simple matter of gravity. I think that as they grow taller, there's a critical width to height ratio that the males achieve faster than the females, because of course their dorsal fins are taller than the females. And a lot of smaller species like bottlenose dolphins never reach that critical height to width ratio for their dorsal fins. But the male orcas do, and when they reach it, it just starts to become susceptible to gravity. The connective tissue in the dorsal fin can't resist gravity anymore. And because they spend so much time at the surface, they directly reverse the amount of time they spend at the surface in captivity over the wild. In the wild, a lot of what whales do is hidden from us because it's below the surface. They spend about 80 to 90% of their time below the surface doing what they do. And then 10%, 20% of the time at the surface, also doing things, but primarily breathing. And so, we don't see a lot of what they do. In captivity, it's the exact reverse. They spend 80 to 90% of the time at the surface because that's where everything's happening in their impoverished lives, and only about 10 to 20% of the time below the surface of the water. And of course, it's not very deep anyway. Well, as they grow in the wild and their dorsal fin is most of the time underwater, the water column itself keeps the dorsal fin straight and true. As they're swimming forward, the water pushes on the dorsal fin on both sides and keeps it growing up straight and true. I mean, it's a very simple physical phenomenon. Whereas in captivity, they're at the surface and gravity is acting, which it doesn't underneath the surface. It's one of the reasons they use underwater training for astronauts. Gravity doesn't really work under the surface of the water. And so the dorsal fin's not subject to it. Whereas in captivity, where they're spending their time at the surface, and the dorsal fin is sticking out of the water, gravity does get to act on it. So that's our hypothesis. We'd love to test it. One day, I hope we are able to. What can we do as a student other than not supporting these facilities? Well, you'd be surprised how much not supporting these facilities actually does for these animals. So please continue to do that. But what else you can do? Well, social media. It's what stopped the whale jail. It's what closed that. It, it has closed a couple of facilities. It has changed the laws in certain countries. Canada just outlawed the display of captive whales and dolphins, and that was public pressure. So you should keep track of your legislators. You should contact your legislators if you want, and just basically tell them, when they've got the time and when they can focus on it, could they please consider supporting such legislation? It happened in Canada, and it was successful. It's happened in several other countries too, but I point to Canada because they actually have quite a few captive whales and dolphins, including orcas, and they still managed to get this bill passed. So supporting legislation, supporting alternatives, all right, supporting alternatives. Basically, go to a museum, which has, hopefully an excellent natural history section. The whale and dolphin exhibit at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum is astounding. It's really good. Sometimes models, sometimes animatronics, sometimes video, all of which are very compelling when they're well done and showing their natural habitat in its full three-dimensional glory is very different than just seeing a whale or dolphin perform a trick in a tank. So, support all of those options. Read these big, beautiful picture books, buy them, support your local bookstore. All of these things are things you can do as a regular citizen to help change the world, quite frankly, not just for whales and dolphins, but a lot of other things as well. Have you been able to travel a lot as an orcobiologist? Well, obviously not in the last year. My travel has been completely ended for the last year. But prior to that, I've been to about 56 countries. I've been to China 3 times, Russia 3 times, and a bunch of other countries in Europe, Africa, South America. I love the travel I do. It's all for my work as a marine mammal biologist. The nice thing about marine mammals is they live in cool places. And so if you're a marine mammal biologist, you sometimes get to go to those cool places to see what it is they're doing. I also travel a lot for my work now as an advocate. I give a lot of lectures. I give a lot of presentations to government officials. I've presented at a lot of government meetings with legislators and government officials in the executive branches, to get them to change not just legislation, but also regulation of various activities, not just captivity, but whale watching, whaling, and so on. And so I do get to travel around the world. And it is, for me, a lot of fun. I really enjoy it. I love being in other countries, experiencing other cultures, and seeing how they look, react to and feel about, whales and dolphins. It's not always the same as what you get here in the United States. What should SeaWorld do with the orcas they still have? They should retire them to seaside sanctuaries. I didn't have a slide about seaside sanctuaries, but I can certainly give you some more information about that. I urge you all to go to www.whalesanctuaryproject.org. It's all one word, whalesanctuaryproject.org. That website will tell you a lot about the sorts of things that are going on with whale sanctuaries. We're trying to get the first one in North America off the ground. There is one that's operational in Iceland that takes belugas. I'm on the board of the Whale Sanctuary Project, and we are working very hard to bring that sanctuary online by 2022. It will take belugas first, but also perhaps orcas eventually, in which case some of the orcas, certainly that are in captivity around the world, might be able to retire there. Sanctuaries are basically like any wildlife sanctuary. It's where a former captive whale or dolphin could go and live out the rest of its life in a more natural setting without the rigidity of a show schedule and without any obligations. They wouldn't have to perform for their supper, as it were. And they would be able to behave more naturally. They'd be able to choose who they associate with a little bit more. If they didn't like a particular whale or dolphin, we would have enough space, unlike a tank. These sanctuaries are going to be many acres in size. They will be fenced off. The whales cannot leave because they're not competent to survive on their own in the wild. That's what captivity has done to them. It's taken away their autonomy, which is really very sad. But we would take care of them in a much larger, more natural space. This is what happens with elephants who are retired to sanctuaries, with tigers, with bears. There are many bear sanctuaries around the world, with chimpanzees who've been retired from laboratories and zoos and circuses for that matter. So, it's not a novel concept, but it would be applied to whales and dolphins for the first time. And so it's a little bit trickier than building a big sanctuary and a big ranch, big open, plains or savanna or forested area versus, doing it in the ocean, which is often government property. And so we're working on it, though. What is the coolest? And that's what I think SeaWorld should do, by the way, not just give us whales. I'm not even expecting them to do that. They don't like us very much. Why don't they build their own sanctuary? That's a win-win for them. It makes them look like heroes, and they can still make money off of those animals. They can charge people to come see them. We wouldn't do that. We're nonprofit, but they could. And if they did that, they'd be heroes. The whales would be in a better situation. They'd be able to behave more naturally. They'd be able to dive deeper, swim in a straight line for longer, maybe even start eating wild live fish again. And, they could charge a ticket price to come and see them. So why don't they do it? But they won't. They absolutely put their foot down and won't do it. And so that's something else you can do as a regular citizen, is just very politely, don't harangue them and insult them. They're not going to listen to you if you do that. Actually, just tell them that's what you want them to do, because it is what you want them to do. And it's the right thing to do. And I'm hoping we can all together persuade them sometime in the near future to do their own sanctuary. And what's the coolest cetacean behavior you've ever observed in the wild? Okay, that's a good story. Here we go. Let me see. How much time do I have? All right, I have 4 minutes to tell you this story. So I was doing my research up in British Columbia, and I had a boat that I followed the whales around with an assistant in the boat with me, and we took behavioral observations. I was studying the social associations between males and everybody else in the population. I was very interested in the fact that males lived with their mothers for their whole lives. So if you watched my TED Talk, you'll hear all about this extremely interesting social structure where sons live with their mothers for their whole lives. They don't mate with their mothers. They don't mate with their sisters. They live with them, and then they go off and date, some other female, unrelated female, make babies and then come home. And so I was doing that, and I saw a female whale that I knew. I wasn't really as interested in her as the males, given my topic of research, but I certainly loved watching them. And she had her head up against a rock. This is a very rocky shore, very steep, rocky shore. So the coast basically dropped very steeply down into the depths of the body of water we were in. And so, she literally could swim right up to the wall of rock that formed the shore, very similar to, say, the wall in a tank, and put her head up against the rock, right at the surface of the water. And she was doing this. And it made me realize she had a big salmon, they feed on 30 plus pound salmon, stuck in a crevice in that rock. This is, very, complex features in this rock. Lots of crevices and caves and cracks. And she had chased a fish into one of them. And what she was doing by putting her head up against it like that was preventing it from backing out. Fish can't, salmon can go in reverse, but this fish couldn't, because there was a killer whale head keeping her from doing that. And what she was waiting for was for the salmon to become anoxic. Anoxic means without oxygen. She was waiting for the whale to become woozy, woozy from lack of oxygen, because she was keeping it from refreshing the water in the crevice. The water that the fish was actually extracting oxygen from to breathe was slowly being depleted of oxygen, and it wasn't flowing, so that oxygen couldn't be replaced. And when that fish got woozy enough, it would just sort of stagger out drunk, and boom, she'd eat it without any problem at all. How long she waited for that fish to become woozy was actually a cost-benefit analysis. She could decide to wait 10 minutes, 12 minutes. How much longer should she wait before it starts to back out, before she gives it up as a bad job and goes and looks for another fish? Well, it turns out to be about 11 minutes. They've actually observed enough of this phenomenon of where they chase the fish into these rock crevices in that particular area to know it's about 11 minutes. She'll wait patiently for about 11 minutes. Well, I drove up to her, and she was so intent on keeping that fish in the rock crevice that she just let me do it. I was set ashore about 30 feet away from her, and I walked up to her until I was about 10 feet away from her, 5 feet away, and then I stopped about 5 feet away from her. Think about that as a body length away from her. And she was looking at me, she could see me, but she was very busy with this fish. And she just looked at me, and then she looked back, and I just stayed, back about 5 feet. I felt kind of bad after a while. I was bothering her, so I called the boat back and left. I never saw her catch the fish or give up on the fish. I didn't see either outcome because I felt like I was bothering her. But she let me get pretty close. It was as close as you would get to a captive whale, but she was free to come or go. And that is the way I urge everybody to experience these animals, is in their own habitat, in their own world, with responsible whale watching. It's the only way you can do. You can leave these animals to their own devices and respect them. I can answer that last question, which is about internships or summer programs. If you want to contact me, I do have some suggestions, but fewer than you'd think. I actually am, of course, not dealing with students as often as I would as a professor or something. And so I'm not as up on that kind of program, but I do have some suggestions. So please contact me at naomi@awionline.org if you want to know about those. And I'm done. It's 4:00.
Thank you very much. I love that whale story. I've not heard that orca story from you, so that was really great. I'm glad that person asked. So thank you so much. We appreciate you very much. And thanks to everyone for listening and